All right, so in the last lesson, we looked at how we could get tasks from our task provider and read it both inside our task screen as well as our task list. Now, in this lesson, I want to look at how we can add a new task to our task provider. And that task is going to come from our add task screen. So when a user types a new task in here and they press the add button, then that data is coming in right here inside this widget, this part of the tree. And that data needs to go and update our task object. So we add a new task to that list. And then we want to be able to listen for changes in that provider, both inside our task screen to update the number of tasks, as well as inside our task list so that we can actually add the new item into the list and rebuild the list. If you think you can tackle this, then pause the video now and try to give that a go and complete this functionality of making that add task screen work and seeing it inside the list, as well as seeing it update the number right here. And once you're done having a go, then come back and I'll show you my solution and we can talk through it. All right, so in order to add a task, we of course do that inside our add task screen. And the way that it works at the moment is we have this text field where the user types in a new piece of text, which is going to correspond to the new task. And then we save that inside a local property called new task title. And when the user is finally done changing or typing in the text field, then they press the add button. And it's in that moment where we trigger a callback that takes that value and puts it back over inside our task screen, where we call a set state and add the new task to our list of tasks. But now our list of tasks doesn't exist and our task screen is not even stateful anymore, so we can't use set state either. So let's see how we might do this in the provider way. Now, one way that you might think it could be done is like this. If I go ahead and delete my callback inside my add task screen so that it becomes just a simple stateless widget being created as the modal bottom sheet, then I can go into my add task screen and I'm going to also delete my call to that method right here and delete all of these properties which passes over that callback. So now the way that you might think we could do this is when the onPressed is called, we create a new task and that task is going to have the name created from that local property, which was called new task title. So let's put that in there. And of course, it doesn't know about task because we're not importing the model/task ... So let's go ahead and do that. So we now have created a new task based on what the user typed in. And you might think that we could simply just tap into the provider ... and also tap into the model/task data ... and simply write inside the onPressed provider.of, and the data type will be a task data type. And now we have access to our task data object where we can simply say .tasks.add, and we add that new task over here. And then finally we call the navigator.pop right here, and then we pop away this current screen. Now, this kind of sort of makes sense in theory, especially this part, but in practice, if we go ahead and run this, you'll notice that it doesn't actually work. So let me go ahead and show you. I've typed in a new task, I press add, it correctly dismisses that screen, but nothing gets added. So what's going on right here? Well, remember how when we were going through the examples, we mentioned that you can't just change the string by simply tapping into that property data and giving it a new value by setting it to some new value, you have to do it through a method because we need to call notify listeners. And that is a method that comes from the change notifier class, which updates all the places which listens to the state of that particular property so that they can redraw and rebuild. Similarly, over here, if we simply just add this new task to our tasks list, and without calling that notify listeners, nothing is going to be notified, nothing is going to happen. Instead, what we have to do is we have to create a method, and we'll call it add task, where we pass over the string of the new task title, and inside this method is where we're going to tap into our tasks, and we call the .add, and we add a new task. So we can either do it in line over here, or we can create it right here. So final task equals new task, which has the name of the new task title, and then we pass it in to add this new task into our task list. But most importantly, we call notify listeners once we're done, so that we update all the listeners on the latest state of the task object that they're listening to. So now inside our add task screen, instead of doing all of this, we would instead delete this firstly, and we would call provider.of of task data, and we tap into that method we created just now, add task, and we pass in that new task title, which comes in through here via our text field. So now if I go ahead and hit save and I try to check it out again, you can see that if I add a new task, go to the gym and click add, you can see it gets added to the list because of that important notify listeners method being called, so that everybody who's listening to the task right here as well as in the list, they all update accordingly. It's actually quite dangerous if we simply just leave our tasks like this, because it means that sometime down the line, when we forget about all of this knowledge that we've learned about provider, we might get into the situation again where we think, oh, I could just say .tasks, .add, and add a new task. So in order to save ourselves from making this mistake in the future, because remember that you have to be kind to your future self, right? So as a programmer, but also in life, you have to make life easier for the future version of yourself. So let's try and figure out how we can prevent ourselves from making this mistake in the future, so we don't have to actively remember, oh yeah, I can't just tap into this list and just use .add or .remove. I actually have to do it via a method where I notify the listeners. So instead of allowing this task to be accessible everywhere, keeping it public, I'm going to add that underscore in front of it to make it a private property. So now it's only accessible within the two walls of curly braces here, and I can tap into it inside my methods and also inside my getter right here. So both when I'm returning my task count as well as when I'm adding a task, I'm tapping into this private version of tasks. And now if I tried to tap into tasks from the outside, I can no longer do that. It's no longer accessible to anybody outside. So I'm now forced to use the add task method in order to add that new task title as a string for my new task. So this minimizes any errors. But now there's a kind of a problem, right? Because I use that tasks elsewhere. And those places are, for example, here, when I'm trying to read from that task list. If that task list is now private, well, how am I supposed to read it here? And that's why I'm getting all these errors. Well, let's go ahead and create a getter for this task. So down here, I'm going to create a new list, which is going to be of type task, and it's going to be public. So it's going to be called tasks without that underscore. And then here I'm going to create a getter by, remember, adding the get keyword in front of the name of the property, opening a set of curly braces, and then returning the value that I'm going to compute, which is simply going to be our private version of the task. Now, you might think that this would work because now we don't have any problems in here and we can access the tasks, but we've now kind of gotten back to the same place, right? I can now again tap into tasks. I can try to add a value to it, and now I'm in the same problem as I had before. So how can we make sure that we don't do this? And instead, we make sure that we use our add method and safety check this. Well, instead of just using a bog standard list in our computed property, our task, which has the getter, I'm going to use something called a unmodifiable list view. And that comes from the Dart collections library. So that's what I'm going to import. And then here I'm going to change that type to a unmodifiable list view. Now, this is kind of a misnomer, if you will. I don't like the way that this class is named because it makes you think of list views as in the widget, like here where we have a list view. But it's really not a list view widget at all. It's in fact another version of a list data type, but it's kind of a view of another list. So this is why they're calling it a unmodifiable list view. It's kind of like you're looking at a version of the list, but you're looking at that list through a window pane. So you can't touch it, you can't change it. And in fact, if you try to say, I don't know, inside add task, let's, for example, try to tap into our tasks unmodifiable list view, and we tried to call .add on it and add a new task object with a random name, then even though it doesn't give you an error right here, which I wish it did, but it will actually give you an error when you run it, because if we hold down command, we click on this add function and look at how it's implemented, you can see all it does is it just throws an error. It tells you that you can't add to an unmodifiable list because this method is not supported in an unmodifiable list. That's the whole point, right? We're not meant to be able to modify this list. So now I can create my unmodifiable list view and I can return a unmodifiable version of my tasks. So now theoretically, it should mean that when I try to access this tasks directly from the outside and I try to modify it, I should get an error somewhere down the line. So now I can kind of be a little bit safer in my use of this task data class. And I'll now be reminded to always use the version which calls the notify listeners, which is through that method add task. Now that we're done with our code and we're done with increasing the safety of our code, we're ready to go ahead and hit save and check out our app. So let's go ahead and add a new item, go to the gym. I really need to go to the gym. So I'm going to add that to my list. And now you can see it updates right here where we're listening inside our task list via our consumer. And also it updates right here where we're listening using our provider.of task data. So did you manage to get it to work? And did you get tripped up by that notify listeners method call? Again, if this is confusing, it's worth going into a simpler version. So going back to that state management example app where everything is super simple, super easy to understand, and messing about with the code over there, just so that you can get the hang of it and write the code yourself. Now in the next lesson, we're going to look at the next part where we check off items in our task list without the need of a set state or a stateful widget. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.